Spain did not change from one day to the next. It was not an immediate breakup or a sudden collapse. It was a slow process that was built with decisions, tensions, and errors accumulated over time. Everything began to take shape on January 3, 1874, when General Pavia burst into the Congress of Deputies and put an end to the First Republic, a political attempt that had barely lasted 11 months and that did not have enough time to consolidate itself in a deeply divided society. From that moment on, the course was set. The army made it clear that it did not trust that experiment and opted to return power to the monarchy. A few months later, on December 29, 1874, General Martinez Campos proclaimed Alfonso, the young Alfonso. During the following decades, especially between the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th, the country experienced superficial stability, marked by agreements between parties that shared power while large sectors of the population were left on the sidelines. In parallel, social reality began to change, industrialization advanced unevenly, working conditions were harsh and discontent began to grow in different parts of the territory. In 1890 there were important changes such as the expansion of male suffrage, but this opening did not mean a real transformation of power, since control continued to be concentrated in the hands of a minority. Meanwhile, foreign conflicts added pressure. Between 1895 and 1898, the wars in Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines further weakened Spain's position in the world, and in 1898 the loss of the last great colonies was consummated, a blow that affected both the economy and to the identity of the country. That same period was marked by the death of key figures. In 1897 Antonio Cánovas del Castillo was assassinated, which left an important void within the political structure that had sustained stability for years. From there, a different stage began, known as post-Cánovism, in which internal tensions began to become more visible. The economy was oriented towards protectionism to try to compensate for the losses, while social inequality continued to increase. Some labor reforms were introduced to stop the unrest, but they were insufficient. The working classes still did not have true political representation and discontent continued to grow. At the same time, the country was dragging internal conflicts such as Carlism, in addition to new ideological currents that were beginning to gain strength. Anarchism and socialism were beginning to organize and question the established order. All this occurred while in other parts of Europe profound transformations were already taking place, leaving Spain in an increasingly behind position. What seemed like stability hit a constant accumulation of tensions, a silent pressure that did not disappear, but rather grew as the years went by, preparing the ground for much deeper changes that would come in the following decades. The turn of the century did not bring real stability. What seemed like control began to show signs of wear. And in that context, on May 17, 1902, Alfonso. His arrival marked the beginning of a new stage, but it also evidenced something deeper, the slow decomposition of the structure inherited from the end of the 19th century, a way of governing that had left out a large part of the population, especially the working classes, who had no real access to political life. Workers, intellectuals, and dissatisfied sectors. During the first years of the reign, governments followed one another quickly. In 1903, figures like Mora and other leaders assumed responsibilities in the midst of a constant transition, but this rotation did not solve the underlying problem. The king himself intervened in key decisions, generating institutional tensions that further weakened stability. One of the most delicate moments occurred when authority in the military sphere was questioned, opening a crisis that revealed the limits of constitutional power. Between December 1904 and July 1905 there were changes in the government that reflected the lack of cohesion. Meanwhile, in the social field, tension continued to grow. In Barcelona, in 1905, an incident related to satirical publications provoked a direct reaction from the army, which responded by attacking printing presses and critical media, which led to the approval of laws that expanded military jurisdiction over the civilian population, marking a turn towards harsher positions. At the same time, at the international level, Spain tried to maintain influence. Between January and March 1906, the Algeciras Conference was held, where the reorganization of North Africa was addressed, and where Spain participated together with other European powers, but this attempt at external presence contrasted with the internal fragility that continued to grow. In that same year, in May 1906, Alfonso. The distance between power and the population increased, decisions were made in small circles while the unrest spread, and although on the surface the country continued to function, deep down a much deeper change was being prepared, one that would not manifest itself immediately, but that was already underway, advancing step by step towards a stage of greater conflict and transformation. As the first years of the 20th century progressed, the tension stopped being silent and began to manifest itself visibly. The country was no longer just accumulating unrest, it was beginning to react. In 1907, Antonio Mora came to power with the intention of reinforcing internal control, toughening political measures and further limiting freedoms in an attempt to contain a reality that was already changing too quickly. But the real turning point occurred in 1909, when the Spanish presence in Morocco was transformed into an open conflict. What until then had been a limited intervention became an increasingly costly war, both in resources and lives. The resistance in African territory was intense, and the initial defeats, such as that of Barranco del Lobo in July 1909, generated a strong reaction within Spain. The war was not only fought abroad, it was beginning to move to the interior of the country. The sending of troops, many of them made up of workers without resources, caused deep rejection, especially in cities like Barcelona, where mandatory mobilization was perceived as an injustice. The accumulated unrest then found a means of direct expression. Between July 26 and 28, 1909, the situation exploded. What began as a protest quickly transformed into a generalized revolt. The so-called Tragic Week brought all the contained tension to the surface. The streets were filled with confrontations, barricades were erected, religious buildings were set on fire, and order was completely overwhelmed for several days. The response was forceful. The army intervened to regain control, and the repression was harsh, marking a before and after in the relationship between power and the population. The impact of those days was not limited to immediate violence. It left a deep mark that showed that the balance that had been maintained for decades could no longer be sustained in the same way. In the following years, far from stabilizing, the situation continued to deteriorate. In 1912, the murder of José Canalejas in Madrid confirmed that political violence had become part of the reality of the country. That same year marked the end of one of the most serious attempts at reform from within power, once again leaving a void that was difficult to fill. From that moment on, politics entered a phase of constant instability. Governments followed one another without being able to consolidate, decisions were made under pressure, and social tensions continued to increase. Meanwhile, Europe entered a new stage with the start of the First World War in 1914, a conflict from which Spain remained aloof, but whose economic and social consequences were strongly felt inside. Neutrality did not bring calm, on the contrary, it intensified inequalities. While some sectors benefited from the situation, others saw their conditions worsen, discontent grew, and protests multiplied. The country moved towards a scenario where stability was no longer a real option, but rather an illusion that was crumbling little by little. What had begun as an attempt to maintain order after 1874 was turning into a deepening crisis, a crisis that could no longer be hidden and that paved the way for a much greater rupture in the years to come. Starting in 1917, the tension stopped being a diffuse sensation and became an open crisis. That year marked a breaking point where multiple conflicts coincided at the same time. On the one hand, discontent within the army, on the other, political pressure from different sectors, and, at the same time, a growing social mobilization that questioned the direction of the country. In July 1917, the situation reached a critical level. The military organized meetings to defend their interests, while political representatives met in Barcelona demanding profound changes, and in parallel, the labor movement promoted strikes that paralyzed key sectors. The country was divided into multiple fronts that could no longer be managed with the previous formulas. In the following years, instability became the norm, governments followed one another without the ability to consolidate, decisions were made under constant pressure, and social unrest continued to grow. In cities like Barcelona, conflict reached extreme levels, with clashes between workers and forces linked to business interests, generating a climate of sustained violence that showed the fragility of power. In 1920, the assassination of Prime Minister Eduardo Dato confirmed that political violence had reached irreversible levels. That same period was marked by a significant increase in strikes, confrontations, and radical actions, as the country moved towards a situation that was increasingly difficult to control. However, the hardest blow would come shortly after. On June 5, 1921, in North Africa, the Spanish army suffered one of its greatest defeats. The Battle of Annual became a symbol of military failure and internal disorganization. Thousands of soldiers died or were captured in a chaotic retreat that exposed serious planning and leadership errors. The impact was immediate. Public opinion reacted with indignation, responsibilities were demanded, and a large-scale political crisis arose. The prestige of the army was deeply damaged, and confidence in the country's leadership was weakened even further. What until then was an accumulation of tensions became an evident loss of control. Between 1921 and 1923, the situation did not improve. The war in Morocco continued to generate wear and tear, social tensions continued to increase, and politics was blocked, unable to offer clear solutions. In this context, on September 13, 1923, General Primo de Rivera carried out a coup d'état, ending the previous stage and beginning a new phase under military control. With this movement, a cycle that had begun decades ago was closed. What in 1874 had been presented as a way to stabilize the country now ended in direct intervention by the army, showing that the previous structures could no longer sustain the reality that had been formed over time. The country thus entered a new stage, marked by the suspension of political life as it was known until then. But far from solving the accumulated problems, this decision only postponed a much deeper transformation that was still to come. After the coup d'état of September 13, 1923, Miguel Primo de Rivera assumed control of the country with the support of King Alfonso. On the external level, the war in Morocco continued until, in 1925, the collaboration between Spanish and French forces allowed the situation to be reversed after the landing at Al Hoceima, marking the beginning of the end of the African conflict. This military success gave a momentary respite to power, but did not resolve the internal problems that continued to accumulate. Despite some specific advances, the reality of the country did not change in essence. The lack of representation, social tensions, and the disconnection between power and the population continued to be present. With the passage of time, even sectors that had initially supported the intervention began to distance themselves, and political wear and tear became evident. Towards the end of the decade, the situation became unsustainable. In January 1930, Primo de Rivera resigned and left the country, leaving behind a weakened structure and an increasingly questioned monarchy. The king tried to redirect the situation by appointing new governments, but trust was already deeply eroded. The following months were marked by failed attempts to recover normality. While support for Republican forces and new forms of political organization grew, discontent was no longer an isolated phenomenon, it had spread across broad sectors of society. The decisive moment came on April 12, 1931, when municipal elections were held that, although apparently local, became a clear indicator of the real state of the country. In the large cities, where social change was most visible, the Republican candidates obtained a resounding victory. 2 days later, on April 14, 1931, the Second Republic was proclaimed, ending the reign of Alfonso XIII, who left the country without a direct confrontation, thus closing a stage that had begun decades ago with the intention of stabilizing the country. What followed was not simply a change of political form, it was the result of a long process, built over years of accumulated tensions, failed decisions, and social transformations that could no longer be contained. Spain was entering a new phase, with new expectations, new challenges and a reality profoundly different from the one that had given rise to the Restoration. Because historical processes do not stop, they evolve, they adapt, and, when the pressure exceeds certain limits, they end up transforming everything. And what was to come would be even more intense. With the proclamation of April 14, 1931, Spain entered a completely new stage. It was not just a political change, it was the consequence of decades of social transformation that had finally surpassed the limits of traditional power. The new government assumed responsibility for reorganizing the country at all levels, from the institutional structure to the living conditions of the population. One of the first objectives was to draft a new constitution, a process that began immediately and that sought to establish a broader base of participation and rights. In May 1931, religious freedom was proclaimed, marking a break with the historical influence of the church in public life. At the same time, reforms were proposed aimed at improving the situation in the countryside, where inequality was especially evident, and changes were promoted in the military sphere with the aim of modernizing and reducing its direct influence on politics. On June 28, 1931, elections were held that gave rise to a parliament dominated by reformist forces, which allowed progress in the drafting of the new constitution, finally approved on December 9 of that same year. This text established a framework based on individual rights, territorial reorganization, and a new balance between powers, reflecting the intention of adapting the country to a different social reality. However, from the beginning, the new stage was marked by deep tensions. On the one hand, sectors that promoted rapid and structural changes; on the other, groups that saw in these transformations a direct threat to their interests and their way of understanding the country. This division was not superficial, it was rooted in economic, social, and ideological differences that had accumulated over decades. In the workplace, labor organizations increased their influence, promoting mobilizations and pressuring to accelerate reforms. Meanwhile, in other areas of the country, especially in rural areas, resistance to changes generated constant conflicts. The distance between expectations of transformation and the real capacity to apply them became increasingly evident. The new stage was advancing with important decisions, but also with a growing tension that did not disappear. The country was not starting from scratch, it had a complex history, with deeply unequal social structures and an increasingly mobilized population, which turned each reform into a point of friction. What had begun as an opportunity for reorganization was gradually transformed into a scenario of confrontation, where each advance generated a reaction, and where the balance became increasingly difficult to maintain. After the approval of the Constitution in December 1931, the new political power began a phase of profound reforms with the aim of transforming structures that had been without real changes for decades. The leadership of Manuel Azaña marked this stage, focused on modifying key aspects such as land ownership, the organization of the army, education, and the relationship between the state and the church. In the agrarian sphere, the priority was to correct a deeply unequal situation. Large extensions of land remained in the hands of a few owners while a large part of the peasantry lived in precarious conditions. The proposal sought to redistribute these lands and allow those who worked them to access them, with the intention of generating a more stable economic base and reducing the social imbalance in the countryside. At the same time, a transformation was promoted in the army, not only from an organizational point of view, but also adapting it to the real needs of the country, reducing its size and limiting its political role, a measure that sought to avoid the interventions that had marked previous stages. In the educational and cultural field, a profound modernization was proposed, separating teaching from the direct influence of the church and promoting a more secular education, oriented to new ways of thinking. This decision generated a strong reaction, since it affected an institution that had had a central role for centuries. The reforms were not limited to these areas. The territorial issue was also addressed, opening the door to forms of autonomy in regions with their own identities, which represented a significant change in the organization of the country and in the way of understanding national unity. However, each of these movements generated an immediate response. conservative sectors, property owners, part of the army and religious groups perceived these transformations as a direct threat to their position, which caused increasingly intense opposition. Tension began to grow at all levels, in the countryside, in the cities, in the institutions. What was initially considered a modernization process began to become a scenario of confrontation, where each reform opened a new front. The country was advancing, but it was doing so on an increasingly unstable line, where expectations of change constantly collided with existing resistance, and where the possibility of maintaining a lasting balance became increasingly difficult. The reformist stage was not only transforming structures, it was redefining the relationship between the different groups that made up society, and in that process, tension stopped being a secondary element and became the central axis of political life. Starting in 1933, the course of the Republic changed clearly. The elections ushered in a period dominated by right-wing forces that stopped a large part of the reforms initiated in the previous years. This period, known as the Black Biennium, not only modified political decisions, it also altered the balance that had been attempted to build since 1931. Tensions increased rapidly, distrust between blocs became deeper, and the conflict ceased to be solely political and moved to the streets. In October 1934, an insurrection broke out that was especially intense in Asturias and Catalonia. In the north, it adopted a social character with strong worker participation, while in Catalonia it was linked to an institutional rupture that directly questioned central power. Both movements were put down by the army, leaving a scenario marked by repression and even more division. Accented. After these events, the country was structured in increasingly rigid positions, where each decision reinforced the perception of threat in the opposing bloc. The space for agreements was drastically reduced and politics began to revolve around permanent confrontation. In February 1936, new elections were held and the Popular Front won, which returned power to a left-wing coalition that tried to resume the pending reforms, but the context was already different. The accumulation of tensions had completely transformed the scenario, and each measure was interpreted as a step towards a greater confrontation. Political violence intensified in the following months. Attacks, confrontations, and organized actions took place in different parts of the country, creating a climate of constant instability. In July 1936, the murder of a lieutenant of the assault guard was followed by the death of a highly relevant political leader, an episode that showed to what extent the situation had surpassed any capacity for institutional containment. On July 17, 1936, a military uprising began in North Africa, and the next day, July 18, it spread to the peninsula. What at first seemed like a limited uprising quickly transformed into a generalized conflict. The territory was divided and the structures of the state stopped functioning in a unified manner. The war had started. Not as a spontaneous rupture, but as the consequence of a prolonged process in which unresolved tensions, incomplete reforms, and increasingly deep conflicts accumulated. For more than half a century, the country had tried to maintain a balance that was never fully consolidated. From the restoration that began in 1874 to the transformations of the Republic, each stage left open new fractures that, over time, became incompatible with each other. In 1936, these fractures stopped coexisting, and they began to confront each other directly. With the outbreak of July 1936, the country stopped functioning as a unified structure and was divided into two areas that responded to completely different projects. In a matter of weeks, the territory fragmented and each part began to organize according to its own objectives, resources, and forms of control. In the rebellious area, command was progressively concentrated. As the first months progressed, the need for coordination led to unifying the military leadership, and finally control was in the hands of a single direction, which allowed a more centralized organization and a more defined strategy on the ground. On the Republican side, the situation was more complex. Different political forces, unions, and armed groups coexisted that shared the objective of stopping the uprising, but did not always agree on the way to do it. This diversity made military coordination difficult in the first moments, although over time an attempt was made to reorganize the forces by creating a structured army to replace the initial militias. The conflict did not take long to acquire an international dimension. From the beginning, both sides sought foreign support. The European powers officially adopted a position of non-intervention, but in practice, aid arrived unequally, which directly influenced the development of the conflict. On the rebel side, external support made it possible to strengthen military capacity, especially in key aspects such as aviation and logistics, while on the Republican side, aid was more limited and depended largely on specific supplies and the participation of foreign volunteers who were integrated into combat units. As the months progressed, the conflict transformed into a prolonged war, with phases of advance and stagnation, where control of the territory became the decisive factor. Some operations marked key moments, but the final result was conditioned by the ability to maintain a cohesive and sustained military structure over time. The war stopped being just an internal confrontation and became a scenario where broader ideological and strategic tensions were reflected, which went beyond the country itself, which increased its complexity and prolonged its duration. What had begun as a military uprising ended up becoming a total conflict, where not only armies faced each other, but also completely different models of political, social, and economic organization. The country had crossed a point of no return. And the outcome would depend not only on strength on the battlefield, but on the ability to sustain a long-term project in the midst of an increasingly extreme reality. As the war progressed, the balance between both sides progressively tilted. What had initially been an uncertain confrontation began to show a clearer direction, the capacity for organization, control of the territory, and the support received from abroad marked decisive differences in the development of the conflict. During 1937 and 1938, military operations intensified on different fronts. Some offensives marked key moments, but also showed the limitations of each side. Attrition was constant, both in resources and lives, and the war became a prolonged test where resistance and the ability to sustain the effort were decisive. The Ebro Offensive, in 1938, represented one of the most important attempts to change the course of the war, but it did not manage to alter the final result. After that moment, the situation became increasingly difficult for the Republican side, which saw how its ability to maneuver was reduced while the advance of the other side became more constant. At the beginning of 1939, the situation was already unsustainable. Control of the territory was practically defined and the last resistance was concentrated in specific points. In January of that year, the troops advanced on Catalonia, and in February their occupation was completed, leaving the rest of the territory without real capacity for reorganization. Madrid resisted for the longest time, becoming the last symbol of the Republican defense, but the lack of resources and the impossibility of reversing the situation made the outcome inevitable. On March 28, 1939, the troops entered the capital, and a few days later, on April 1, 1939, the end of the war was officially announced. With this, a conflict that had completely transformed the country, not only in material terms, but also in its social, political, and human structure, concluded. The war had not only been a military confrontation, it had been the most extreme manifestation of a process of rupture that had been building for decades. The consequences did not end with the end of the fighting, they deeply marked the subsequent development of the country, defining a new stage that would last for years and that would condition the course of entire generations. What began as a process of accumulated tensions ended in a total transformation. And its impact would remain present long after the last shot.